The title of the talk is The Professional Life Cycles of Teachers. Thinking of life cycles or cycles, the whole idea of phases and cycles and rhythms is incredibly natural to us. Just thinking about weather, climate, we've got cycles there, whether in the country that you're in mostly, whether it's the wet season, the dry season, the wet season, the dry season, or whether it's more UK-based and it's 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter. We're very used to this idea. We think in terms of phases of human beings' lives as well. We think about the sort of the ages of man, you know, the 7 ages of mankind. And we've got we've got baby, we've got childhood, we've got teenage, adult, middle age, second childhood, and so on. Of course, that's mankind, and we we know that womankind is different. And womankind, we only have 3 ages. See, we've simplified. We've got young, and we might have middle age, and after that we've got, you know, you don't look any different. You just look great. So we solved the problem that way. Somebody called Tuckman even thinks that groups, even groups as short-lived as this one, have phases, and he came up with the phases of forming, norming, storming, performing. I'm sure you've heard this before. The forming is when people come together, they form a group, and the norming is when people start getting the rules and the rituals and the things sorted out. Then there's a bit of storming, where people sort of fight for airtime and fight for dominance and so on. And then there's the performing, where you actually get something done. The tasks are accomplished. And then other people, after Tuckman, have added another stage, which they've called mourning, which is kind of the funny feeling you have when you leave a group after you've been with it for a while. I don't know if you feel like that. Sometimes when you've had a course that you've run and you've really liked the group, and then they all go home, or they leave, and you're kind of, and it takes a few hours at least to feel normal. Maybe we'll be feeling that way on Sunday. It's a bit of mourning there. So this idea of cycles and rhythms and phases is incredibly natural and normal to us. But maybe less familiar to us is the idea of professional life cycles, professional phases. But there are actually there are loads of models available in the literature to us, models of teachers' career stages. So people have mapped this out. A lot of people have thought of it. Some frameworks are about career development. There's one from Steffi and Wolf. They say, well, you have the novice teacher, for example, the apprentice teacher, the professional teacher. Then you get the expert, and then you get distinguished, and then you get emeritus, which is a fantastic sort of plotting out. It's a bit sort of like wishful thinking, I think, though, isn't it? I mean, I have to say the most I have ever felt is sort of moderately professional. So, but anyway, there we are. Some of these models are linear, as that one, and some are cyclical, and some blur the lines between the phases, and some of them are crystal and sharp. All the models, I think, are useful for us in our own work. Because they're just a kind of catalyst for thinking about our work and our own careers and other people's. I've chosen four influences on my talk this afternoon. And between them, I'd like to kind of assemble a possible model which I think might be helpful for us, personally and in our work with other teachers. The ones I draw on are the ones with the asterisks on the reading list, which you should find somewhere amongst the handouts. So the people I specifically mentioned this afternoon are the ones with the asterisks. So the first person I want to say a thank you to is Jennifer Jarvis, who was the senior lecturer in education, ESOL, at the University of Leeds. She's now retired. But for the many years she worked there, she had teachers coming to her on courses from all over the world. They came from Pakistan and Tanzania and Slovakia and all over the place. And she wanted the courses that she ran for those teachers to be maximally useful to them and maximally relevant. So she wanted to find out how the teachers saw their own career development and how they saw their own needs. And in looking around for something to help, she came across the work of Michael Huberman, and she wrote about it in the journal which I edit, which is called the Teacher Trainer Journal, which many of you may know. If you don't, please come and ask me about it. In fact, I've got a special offer, which I'll tell you about later. Right, so the second influence then is Michael Huberman. And he was very interested in how teachers saw their own careers depending on the number of years that they were in the job. And he interviewed teachers who had been in the job for 1 year and all the way up to teachers who had been in their job for 40 years. So we'll come back to Huberman a lot. The next influence on my talk is Patricia Sykes. She was at the Institute of Education in the University of Warwick. And she followed teachers from their probationary year right up to their retirement. She used biographical and narrative approaches. And she wanted to know how secondary school teachers in particular perceive and adapt to aging. So her work is to do with self-perception as people get older, whereas Huberman's is to do with the number of years in the job. She was interested in this because she said, and I quote here, teachers are in the almost unique position of working with a fixed generation from which they move further and further away in terms of age. Well, I suppose lollipop ladies might find themselves in the same situation, but anyway, you get the point. And the fourth person I want to tune you into is Erik Erikson, who I'm sure you know, controversial psychoanalyst, American, 1960s. And he believed that all of us, no matter whether we are teachers or not, we all go through 8 main stages in life. And each of these stages throws up its own particular challenges and its own particular opportunities. So these are the 4 that I'd like to sort of bring in this afternoon. If you're starting to feel a bit sort of overloaded, oh my God, there's 4 different theories and 4 different people I've got to think about, please relax about that, because what I'd like to do actually is sort of talk you through this particular corner of the literature. So that if anything triggers you and you're interested in anything, you can go to it later on yourself. I'll use Huberman's work as the main model. He was the one interested in the number of years in the job. And then I'll thread in some of the other models as we go through. Why do I want to do this? Well, apart from being asked to do it, but why do I actually think it's very useful? I think, first of all, one useful thing that a talk like this can do is to save you time. So I can introduce you to a whole piece of literature which you may not have time to read firsthand yourselves. But I could also maybe alert you to something interesting, and then you could go to it later on using the reading list if you fancy it. More importantly, though, I think this work that I'm going to refer to this afternoon can help us to gain perspective on our own career development and, in fact, on the career development of the other people that we work with in our institutions, in our schools, and the people in this room as well, as we go through the days together. And for those of you, and I think this will be most of you, who have a kind of teacher training or mentoring role in your jobs, then I think that there are some added implications which I'll come to later. So those are kind of the reasons why. Okay then, so let's start with Michael Huberman. He worked in the Geneva canton in Switzerland, and he described the school system there as monolithic, homogeneous, and strong on bureaucracy. Now, I have no idea if IH is similar. Only you can tell me that. But that was his background. And he had two main reasons for his research that he did. His first motive for doing it was, as he says, reckless curiosity. He said that the initial research questions were to him absolutely irresistible. He was just curious about them. He wanted to know, how do teachers view their older peers and their younger peers? How do they think about them? Are there best years for teaching? Are there times when significant numbers of teachers actually think very seriously of leaving the profession? Do teachers feel, if they stay in the same institution, as you perhaps are staying in your institution, do they feel that over the years they come to resemble that institution, rather like owners resemble their dogs after a while? And the really irresistible question to him is burnout an extensive phenomenon? His second motive for doing the research was a bit more mischievous. He felt that people in the school system where he was, the school officials, the people with a little bit of power especially, thought that they kind of knew their teachers. They typecast the teachers a bit. And he thought that they would say things like they knew which teachers would tend to grow stale. The evidential basis for this kind of knowledge was extremely weak. And he said it often rested on a few concrete, lurid instances and a lot of loose talk late at night over brandy. The problem with this kind of typecasting, or this kind of bias towards groups, different groups of teachers, is that any administrator or manager or DOS who tends to make decisions on the basis of these assumptions might actually be denying chances, let's say, of promotion to, let's say, an older teacher, because they might think, well, they're bound to be routinized or jaded or a bit past it. Or, equally well, they might think, oh, this is a younger teacher, a new teacher. They'll have bags of energy. When, in fact, maybe the poor teacher is completely drowning and petrified. So the second motive for doing the research was to try to get a bit more of an evidence base, so that people were not making important decisions on the basis of fairly wild assumptions. Okay, so the study itself. Huberman took engaged about 160 teachers altogether, women and men and all subjects, and mostly secondary level, and obviously of different years of experience. Every single one of those teachers had about 5 hours of interviews in separate sessions. And if you want to know more about the research methods, there's pages and pages of it in the original article. The results. Huberman suggests that we can plot trends in teachers' careers roughly related to the number of years that they've been teaching, but not fixed to this in any individual case. He reminds us that the identification of phases and sequences should be handled very gingerly, as being descriptive rather than normative. And I'm going to say that again because it's quite important, actually, I think. Because once we start getting into the phases, it's very easy to think this is what should happen or this is what does happen. Actually, he says that the things that emerge from his study tend to be fairly typical, but don't suggest that this is the way things should be. So at this point, you might like to find the diagram, which is somewhere in your handout. And we'll start looking at the things that emerged from the study. He started off working with teachers who had been in the job for between 1 and 3 years. As DOSs, do you have any people on your staff that you work with who are literally just starting their teaching? Could you put your hand up if you have? Okay, loads of you do. All right, okay. In the interviews with teachers who had just started, some themes came up. And the first theme was survival. And this indicates a slightly painful beginning, I think. Maybe a bit of reality shock in there, where people who are just starting the job find that actually things are a bit different than they thought they were going to be when they were training. There's a sort of simultaneity and spontaneity in the classroom, which is a bit overwhelming. There's so many students, and they're all doing different things at different times. And there's also the overload of work. I don't know if you can remember when you first started teaching, but I can honestly remember spending about 3 hours of an evening to prepare about 20 minutes of class time. I was literally writing things on my lesson plans like put left foot in front of right foot, then follow up with right. I mean, almost like stage directions to try to get myself thinking through the lesson. So there is this painful beginning, this stressful beginning, overloaded, too much happening, and this feeling of can I survive? A wonderful quote from one of the teachers I met not long ago was a CELTA teacher who just finished her training, and she was working as a full-time as a teacher for the first time, having some behavior problems in the staff in the class. And she said, we had something on this in the CELTA. We had a whole hour on behavior management, and I wrote an essay on it, and I still don't know what to do. So this feeling that there should have been more transfer. Along with this theme of survival, though, emerged the theme of discovery, which is the lighter side, I guess, of the beginning stage. Teachers were kind of proud to have their own class. They didn't share it with anybody else anymore. It was their class. They had their own students, their own classroom. And they were a peer amongst colleagues. They had the right to walk into the room that said staff room. And somebody was desperate for the loo in our college and said, but the place is crowded out. I said, have you tried the staff toilets? Oh, can I go in there? So sort of perception of yourself as staff. Now, don't forget that this is not how things should be. This is just typical that at this very early stage that many teachers either feel this survival shock or this discovery phase. Perhaps we could bring in Sykes here, Patricia Sykes. Remember, she was the one who was looking at perceptions of aging amongst teachers. And she said that she was looking at how teachers perceive themselves when they're young teachers. And she said young teachers very often may feel a bit insecure. And this insecurity can show itself in the classroom in either quite formal behavior or slightly inappropriately informal behavior. It could tend to go either way. Erikson, looking at the challenge of the life stage of coming out of the young adult stage, says that the chief challenge in this stage is intimacy versus isolation. There's this desire for starter teachers sometimes to be close to pupils, to be close to students, to want to be their friend, to socialize with them a lot, if the age range is appropriate. Or at least to be their older brother or sister if they're teaching younger students. So I think both Sykes and Erikson show up some pretty interesting themes. And that is that a young teacher can vacillate between being overly formal and overly informal. with the group and kind of swing between the two sometimes. Sykes says something quite interesting, I think. She said, if the students don't really see the teacher as a real person, and we know that can happen, and certainly not as a friend, and if the younger teacher is in an older staff room where most of the teachers are either married or have got kids or have got loads of friends of their own, then the younger teacher can actually face frustration and disappointment both in the classroom and out. So I think it's kind of interesting. There are some interesting quotes from starter teachers in the study. Teachers at this in the very beginning of their careers, so saying things like, I'm thinking of being a teacher. There's a sort of tentativeness there. I'm doing a bit of teaching at the moment. And then my favourite quote from the study was, I feel a bit of a fraud, actually. You know, I mean, sometimes I'm in class and I look around and wonder where the teacher is, and then I think, oh, it's supposed to be me. I think it's quite delightful. Can you remember that? I can, actually. Long ago, though it was. OK, moving on to the next number of years. Years of teaching from 4 to 6. And there's a possible theme here of stabilization. Now remember, this is just a theme here. It's not how things should be. Some people stabilize early. Some people stabilize late. Some people never stabilize. Some people stabilize early only to destabilize later on. It's a process, this whole business of stabilization, rather than a series of predictable events. So what do teachers feel that this stabilization means to them? Or how does it come about? In the study, the teachers who were interviewed said things like, they started making a commitment to teaching. Instead of saying, I'm thinking of being a teacher, or I'm doing a bit of teaching at the moment, they start saying, well, I'm a teacher. They choose that role. But it also means giving up the other things that you thought you might be. So if you have, well, you might be a journalist. You're giving up being a journalist. You're not going to go into the theatre and become an actor. You're not going to be a concert pianist, or in my case, study law or whatever. You leave the other professions and careers and you opt for this one. Erikson reminds us that in the psychoanalytic tradition, one healthy process in ego development is making a commitment to a defined professional role. So that's part of the stabilization theme. Other parts are, and these are mentioned by the teachers in the study, being free for the first time from direct supervision and direct observation. So all that probationary stuff, is it still the same in IH? The first 6 months you get watched all the time? I can't remember, sorry. But anyway, the scrutiny gets a little less. A teacher who is stabilizing, in their own words, is starting to get a kind of rudimentary repertoire of routines, ways of setting homework, ways of starting a class, ways of correcting homework, different ways of doing a listening or whatever it might be. So they're getting a repertoire, so they're beginning to feel safer. They're also refining their work and beginning to get their own congenial style, a bit more personal. So there is now a sense of relief, in a way. They're getting the basics, they've got the basics. And a very nice quote from one teacher in Huben said, there's the ability to seize the moment, instructionally speaking. So it starts to snow or something happens, you can use it. And you can only do that when you feel spontaneous enough and free enough and sure enough in your basics. So settling down, finding your feet. If we move on to the next year group, that's people who've been teaching in Huberman's study between 7 to 18 years. The first of the two main themes here are experimentation and activism. Let's take experimentation first. Teachers who are starting to experiment will often do a flurry of small-scale experiments, trying out different materials, trying out different activities, grouping people differently. I always do pairs. Why don't I ever do trios? Okay, I'll do some trios. Moving furniture around in a different way, using different technology. What comes up in the study is a phrase, pedagogical tinkering. It sounds a bit negative, but we'll come back to this. This is a very interesting thing a bit later on, pedagogical tinkering. The idea is to increase your impact in the classroom by working on things that you actually have some control over, things you can control, you can change. Sykes, in interviews with teachers, found that the teachers were now starting to have their own ideas based on their own experiences. In fact, they were trying to forget what they learned in their training and deliberately do their own stuff. And they're now becoming more interested in pedagogy, the how, rather than the subject, the what. So in our field, this would be maybe a teacher starting to get very interested in learner-centered work, for example, and actually not terribly interested in the English language anymore. So there's a movement away from the subject towards the pedagogy. So that's the experimentation thing. You might be more interested, perhaps for yourselves, I don't know, in the activism theme which emerges. This desire of teachers who've been working for quite some time to increase their impact in the classroom leads to an awareness of institutional barriers or constraints. You know, I want to do this, but I'm not allowed to take the students out because the institution says I can't. So this desire to play, to explore, to experiment can sometimes hit a rim of institutional constraints. So what does the teacher do? Okay, they get outside the institution. They go to conferences. They travel further. They get outside their own school. Or they coordinate projects. Or they start running newsletters, editing newsletters, or writing articles. Or going for promotion, becoming DOSs, perhaps. Maybe you would be labeled activists, or the theme of activism would perhaps emerge from this community if you were doing an interview. From the outside, the activists may be seen as quite ambitious. Whiz kids, 120% into the job, the sorts of phrases that people might use about activists. But the fundamental feeling amongst the teachers in this is they just want to develop more. They're really into professional development. And if they can't get the degree of satisfaction from inside the classroom doing this, then they'll go outside, or they'll go up. They'll get promoted. Now, interestingly enough, because that all sounds pretty positive, the experimentation and the activism side sounds pretty positive. But also in Huberman's study of teachers who had been in the job in between 7 and 18 years, there were also the themes of reassessment and self-doubt. Now, this reassessment and self-doubt, in some cases, was just kind of fairly superficial. Teachers talked about feeling a bit routinized, doing the same thing a lot, feeling a bit bored and stale. But for others, it was a complete mid-career crisis. And for others, it was a full-blown existential crisis. So this could go from the mild to the extreme. With teachers saying things like, what on earth am I doing in this job? I don't want to be here. Am I going to die with a piece of chalk in my hand? For chalk, substitute, whiteboard marker, IWB pen, whatever. And one teacher who said, I kind of backed into teaching, and now it's too late to back out. Yeah. So this is this feeling that amongst some who really kind of trapped, or else at least a realization that if they don't act really quickly, all other careers are going to be ruled out. So you can guess that in the interviews amongst these teachers, the words like stale, disenchanted start to arise. And pretty soon we start hearing the word burnt out. Susan Bardoon, who's on your reading list, she has, I think, an excellent definition of burnout. She says, burnout is a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. It culminates in a build-up of negative feelings about our students, our colleagues, and our administration. If we turn, because this sounds kind of pretty psychological here, so if we turn to Erikson again, he would perhaps have said that the crisis of this stage in life is stagnation. That's the challenge. The challenge is stagnation. And what we're trying to achieve is what he would call generation, or regeneration, or generativity, which I don't actually like as a word, but you get the idea. So we have then, in this particular group of teachers who were interviewed, this feeling that things had gone wrong in the sense of there was staleness, there was burnout. Resolution, some of the things which have come up in other circles have been somebody could go part-time. They could get a new responsibility at work, maybe mentoring, or even a non-teaching task, resources management, something like that. They could get a second wind. Sometimes it does happen. They could leave the job altogether, or in the IH world, move to another school and become a less than full weight in somebody else's staff room. Or they could look forward to retirement. Or, and this sounds weird, but yeah, a new hobby. And this comes up again and again in the interviews, you know, and then I turned to yoga. Non-resolution is going to be staying and complaining, procrastinating, peppering your talk with stuff like, oh, they always do that. Or, I mean, that non-resolution is not going to be great, is it? One of the more chilling findings of Huberman's study comes here. Fewer achieved resolution than did not. So this is a bit sobering. So some of the teachers said things like, teaching wears you down. Everyone just muddles through. In 20 years' time, I may be like some of those shriveled up sleepwalkers I see in staff meetings. And this is a thought that sometimes seems to come suddenly in the middle of the night, like a blow of a hammer. Now, in Huberman's study, in fact, non-resolution was just a little bit more true of men than it was of women. And it wasn't just because women sometimes had the children to think about, they took time off for pregnancy leave and that sort of thing. Sometimes the women, a few of the women in Huberman's study, actually kept a separate identity in a slightly different way. One woman, for example, who'd been a teacher for 18 years said, I've always loved painting and I kept painting. And I stayed in touch with other painters. So when things went crazy at school, I could look to these other things and know that at least part of me was still intact. Okay, let's move on to those who've been teaching between 19 and 30 years. By the way, are you all still teaching? Okay. 3 themes coming up here: serenity, relational distance, and conservatism. By the way, these days in the literature, anybody who's been teaching more than 24 years, anybody here been teaching more than 24 years? Loads of people? Good. Do you know we're now called veterans? Yeah, we are. They've thrown out that old emeritus stuff, and now we're called veteran teachers. Anyway, serenity. The teachers who evidenced the serenity theme admitted that they were by now slightly more mechanical in class. They knew that they were slightly more mechanical. But on the other hand, they were more relaxed and they were more self-accepting. And if a class went badly, if a class went wrong, they didn't come out and go, oh, whip myself. I did a terrible failure as a human being. They just said to themselves things like, yeah, it wasn't very good. Just one bad lesson. So, you know, swings and roundabouts there. Relational distance. This is in terms of relational distance between the teachers and the students. Teachers saying things like, you know, my students do stay relentlessly young. The teacher said that the students were still confiding in them. But whereas they used to confide kind of young stuff like parties and boyfriends and girlfriends, they were now confiding different things like, will I ever get a job? So the concerns had slightly changed. Some things get really a lot better. Teachers talk about discipline becoming much easier because just simply through age they were getting more natural authority. Whether that's true in your context or not, it's not true in all cultures, but there was a huge pleasure amongst some teachers in this group, the pleasure of helping and supporting younger colleagues, quite marked. A less pleasant path is conservatism. Although, as we all know, sometimes the most conservative teachers can be the youngest in the staff room. But any teacher who's been going for this long and who seems to evince conservatism is likely to moan about students. They can't spell, they can't concentrate anymore, they don't even turn up half the time. And there's also resistance sometimes to innovation. You know, I don't want to know about Twitter and Facebook and cloud computing, and you chat online if you want to. But there's sort of a resistance sometimes to new things. And a nostalgia for the past. You know, the older I get, the better I was, kind of thing, you know. Something which might be of interest to you, though, as people who did get to be DOSs, when presumably you wanted to be DOSs, Sykes says, those who have not got the promotion they wanted are going to have to alter their perception of the job. Those who have not reached the positions that they hoped for have now got to come to terms with where they are in the school. And they may show a change in commitment, publicly and personally, indicated and confirmed by joining and being seen to join a clique within the staff room. Some decide that the returns are simply not worth the effort, and so they cut down on what they do, while others build up an alternate career or juggle their interests by investing more in their families, in their homes, and in their hobbies. You were the ones that got your promotion. There may have been others going for the same job who didn't get it. So that's worth thinking about. There's a very interesting, I don't know if you heard of the Beloit mindset list. Have you heard about this? It's an attempt by a college, Beloit College in Wisconsin, USA, a deliberate attempt to combat conservatism amongst staff. Every year they produce a list of student behaviors. Well, it's kind of, I'll give you an example of one. For example, 2013, right? students coming into college this year will be mostly born in 1991, which sounds about like yesterday to me, to be honest, but anyway. These students, certain things are true for these students, which will shock older staff members. For example, these students are not surprised that they can pay for a latte on their cell phone. They can curl up in the corner to read a textbook on an electronic screen. And they all know the news before it ever comes on the telly in the evening. They have never used a card catalogue to find a book. Rap music has always been mainstream. Tattoos have always been extremely chic and highly visible. They have never had to shake down an oral thermometer. They've never seen a black and white TV. Put a stamp on a letter and walk to the post. You've got to be joking. And of course, South Africa's official policy of apartheid has never existed in their lifetime. Their lifetime has always included AIDS, and Barbie has always had a job. So that little list, you can get it on the internet. It's really funny. It's sort of reminding you, like, where are my young students coming from? Okay, let's move on. The last group, people who've been teaching for 31 to 40 years. And some themes which emerge here. Disengagement, serene or bitter. Well, let's have a look at this disengagement thing. First of all, I think we have to say that certain physiological changes are now taking place. And these are noticed by children and young people. There's a delightful piece of work done by Greta Dierkink in Holmfeld. She's a Danish writer. And she talked to about 1,000 children who were all roughly 7 years old. She was trying to understand, how they understand things like old people. And a little chap called Klaus, who was 10 years old, he said, I think when you get old, you lose some gravity in your stomach, and that's why you fall over so easily. And then a little kid called Trille, who was 8, she said, I think when you get old, the brain sends out signals, and this turns your hair grey. And my favourite one is Crystal, who was 7 years old. And she said, when you're old, you can't tie your own shoelaces, because if you did, you'd crack. So, there's a big difference now between some of our students and ourselves. Okay, what does serene disengagement involve? Those who evinced this in the interviews were definitely more reflective, coming to terms with their own mortality. And, yeah, well, very necessary, I would say. But it's a task not necessarily made easier when you're surrounded by young people. As one teacher said, it used to be, that my fellow teachers were about the same age as my kids. Now my head of department is the same age as my kids. But on the other hand, the teachers were saying, some of them were saying, well, I've got nothing to lose now, so I'm going to do what I want. But bitter disengagement was a bit different, obviously. There was dejection, there was anger, cynicism, a sense of wasted effort. And some teachers came across as kind of time-serving in their mentality. Mentally retired already, mentally out on the golf course. And by now, it's not just the students and the kids who are saying, he's a bit past it, she's a bit past it. It's the other teachers who are starting to notice that the teacher is perhaps a bit past it. Okay, so there we are. We've got interviews with lots and lots of teachers. We've got quotations and themes emerging from mostly Huberman's study, but also with a little sprinkling of Patricia Sykes and a little drizzle of Erik Erikson. Sort of question generally, do you recognize yourself in any of this? Do you recognize the teachers in your staff room in any of this? I can see lots of people nodding. I think there is an intuitive kind of gut level feeling that this rings true. A lot of this rings true. And I think it's obviously because it's not a top-down model which has been supplied by an external theorist. It's all the names of the phases and all the themes have emerged from teachers talking for hours and narrative inquiry and so on. Huberman says, for some, this process of career development may be linear, but for others there will be plateaus, there'll be regressions, there'll be dead ends, there'll be spurts, there'll be discontinuities. So it's not a simple path. But a couple of interesting things, I think. We were talking about serene disengagement. And on one of your bits of paper that you've got a quote from Huberman. You remember we were talking about pedagogical tinkering earlier on, which is when teachers were trying to make changes within their own classroom. They were trying out different groupings. At the risk of driving you crazy, I'll read it. So if you don't like reading and listening at the same time, look away now, as they say on the telly. Teachers who steered clear of reforms or other multiple classroom innovations, those would be the activists, the people who went broader. So teachers who steered away from that, but who invested consistently in classroom-level experiments, or what they called tinkering, with new materials, different pupil groupings, small changes in grading systems, and so on, were more likely to be satisfied later on in their careers than most others, and far more likely than their peers who had been heavily involved in school-wide or district-wide projects. So, in other words, tending one's own private garden, pedagogically speaking, seems to have more payoff in the long haul than land reform, although the latter is perceived as stimulating and enriching while it's happening. I find that quote extremely interesting as a trainer, because I think it's quite easy sometimes for teacher educators, teacher trainers, DOSs, mentors, whatever we're called, to be a bit sniffy about people who like collecting recipes, who like an activity they can do in their class tomorrow, who come on a course and want to go home with a little basket of goodies ready for Monday morning. And we can get a bit kind of smug about that. And also, you know, I'm the only one in my institution who bothers to go to conferences. We can be a bit superior sometimes, I think. And I think this quote grounds us in the reality of a career and what makes it worthwhile and what pays off in the end. To think of what the implications of all this might be. I think there are some implications for ourselves. And that is, whatever we're going through at the moment, you might have just become a DOS and you might be in your survival stage right now. Or you may be feeling very activist, or you may be destabilizing for some reason, or you may be feeling utterly burnt out and disenchanted. Whatever it is that we're feeling at the moment, the chances are very good that we're not the only one going through it. That this is part of a professional life cycle. Implication for others, as I mentioned before, is in our attitude to others not to be snooty about people who are working with different themes, who are more experimenters than activists. But for mentors, for teacher trainers, for DOSs, I think there's a huge implication, which is somewhere at the bottom. Right, thank you very much. Some final questions a DOS could ask about all this. What phases and themes do I recognize in myself and in the teachers I work with? How can I help to find creative responses to the challenges and opportunities of each phase and theme? And most importantly, I think, for you in your work as DOSs, how can I help to develop an institutional environment where teachers do not feel the stale breath of routine, do not disengage, or end up tending uniquely their own private garden? Isn't it part of our job to try to build that kind of atmosphere? A final thought. Thank you for that. So thanks for your patience. That's kind of it. Ta-da!